be pathogen vectors. They're not going to be disease movers because they've never eaten before. There are some things that can be transferred from mom to children, but for the most part, these are annoying, but generally they're the safest stage to be bitten by. That does change in certain circumstances, but people can end up with these. Some folks, they stand off of a path or they're out hunting and they get into a mess of seed ticks and they end up with dozens or hundreds of them on their ankles and calves. Once they take this first blood meal, they're going to crawl off of their host. They go out into the grass, they shed their exoskeleton, and they move into the second stage of life, which we call nymphal ticks. So they're slightly larger at this point. They have their 8 legs, and they're feeding on slightly larger quarry. So in this instance, we're on a rabbit, and you can see this rabbit is infested with some ticks around its ears and face. So at this point, they're going to take that blood meal again, digest it off of the host, and they're out in the grass, and as they digest it, they'll prepare to shed their exoskeleton the last time, and this is when they become an adult. Adult ticks, these are the ones that we most commonly find on people. We also find them on cattle and deer and horses. At this stage, when they finish taking the blood meal, they're going to drop off of this host, in this case, a dog that we see here, and they're going to drop off this dog, crawl out into the grass, but instead of shedding their exoskeleton and going to an find one another, and then they mate to create the next generation of ticks. And the female will lay her eggs somewhere that's slightly protected. So they need these individual blood meals in order to develop. This is the only thing that they eat. Ticks are hematophages. They cannot digest anything other than blood. They are truly a vampiric type creature. They don't eat pollen. They're never going to nibble on a beetle or a butterfly that they could capture. They're never going to drink nectar. They just eat blood. That's the only thing that they need. Ticks are also quite fascinating because they can go pretty long periods of time in between each blood meal without succumbing to starvation. Some species of tick, they can wait up to a year between blood meals. So for most ticks, they're only going to get about 1 growing season for their life. But some of them, if they are going to miss out on feeding opportunities, they can kind of enter this vegetative state almost, and they'll wait out that lean period and then end up finding a blood meal later on. So it could be a 2-year-old tick that's trying to get on top of you and take a blood meal. Ticks are also specially seemingly designed to be really good ectoparasites. So they're always on the outside of the body, and they start out usually kind of small and thin. An individual tick, it could be about the size of a seed that you might pick off the top of a hamburger bun, and it might also be about the thickness of that seed. But as they feed, their body can expand and take on these kind of prodigious proportions that you see on the left here. You may have heard the phrase before, I'm as full as a tick. And that's how we get this, because their body can just really kind of belly up and get really huge. I always joke that these are the new flavor of fruit gushers, iron flavored, instead of that raspberry or cherry flavor inside of there. Just get some good old irony blood instead. So at this point, it's even difficult for them to walk, but they kind of waddle off and they do what they need to do to get to the next stage of life or to mate. They also have mouths that are specially designed for parasitic activity. So a tick at the tip of the kind of mouth area, we have what we call the chelicera. In a spider, this would be a fang-like object, but in ticks, the chelicera are more of a sort of a scissor. And the scissor helps to cut into the skin of the host, and then they insert what we call the hypostome. The hypostome, in the moving image that you see here, it's that spiky object that's kind of traveling behind the scissors. On the right, it's the spiky object that's kind of closest to us in the viewpoint. So this hypostome is covered with backward-facing spines. Once it's inserted, it is kind of difficult to pull out because those spines catch in the flesh of the host. They also will start to ooze their saliva into the body that they're feeding on pretty quickly after the bite. It helps to thin the blood, but it also kind of helps to cement the tick in place. And so once they've done all of this, if a tick isn't removed, they usually stay attached to that host for about 7 to 10 days. For most people, we catch the tick before this full feeding period and remove it. For wild animals or for cows, of course, this is a little trickier. They can't pull the ticks off. People might not be inspecting them as much and removing them. And so they can be on there for this 10-day period, week and a half period. It can happen to people as well. I once had a client that 10 days after a camping trip, she reported that she felt a strange fluttering under her shirt while she was reading in bed, getting ready for bed at night. And when she pulled up her bed shirt, there was a fully engorged tick that was trying to crawl out from her belly button area. And it had probably been down in there for about 10 days, tanking up on blood. In terms of where ticks live, ticks tend to be in habitat that is shaded, and they like lots of tangled overgrowth. So think of a kind of wild, out of the way area that a lot of wildlife might be going through. That's generally where ticks want to be. Ticks, I've already sort of alluded to them as vampires. They don't really like the sun. They don't like the UV light from the sun. And so they want to be in these shaded, kind of tangled up areas. Unfortunately, with a lot of invasive plant species moving in, we do have kind of a lot of scrubby, overgrown areas, and that gives them a lot of habitat to live in. When ticks are in these areas, they're waiting for hosts. When ticks need a blood meal, they will go to the tips of plant leaves or to the tips of low branches on shrubs, and they will just post up and kind of put their back legs back and brace themselves and put their front legs forward, sticking out in front of them. You can see both of these ticks doing this. We call this questing. They're hoping that something is going to walk by, they give it a creepy little hug, and then they shimmy up the leg of this potential host to try and find a spot to bite. Ticks do not run for the most part. Ticks do not follow things for the most part. Ticks do not jump. They do not fly. Some people have this conception that ticks are in treetops and they kind of leap down when they think they've sensed a host, but really they want to be at about knee height for people. That's a really good zone. That's a really good area to live in because dogs, deer, possums, turkeys, all these different things that are walking through the woods, you can catch them all at about that height. And so it's a lot easier to find a host by doing that. Once they're on their potential host, they move towards a spot of the skin that's thinner and has plenty of blood vessels. Most animals, including people, we don't notice this. Ticks have a really light touch as they walk. You can see that in the video on the right. Most people do not detect this sensation of the tick touching them and walking across the skin. Sometimes they hit a hair and they kind of trip it and you might notice them. I know that I have felt ticks in my beard before because they kind of got stuck on the hairs there. But for the most part, they do this and sneak on and then plug their mouth parts in. And you can see this poor dog on the left there, multiple ticks kind of in the eyebrow area, where if they weren't discovered by their human, they would have been feeding there until they were content. But if you can discover them and remove them, you can circumvent disease transmission and end that blood feeding cycle. I get a lot of tick questions. I would say ticks really dominate a lot of my extension time. Since about 2021, I would say I've spent a lot of time talking about ticks, and it just seems to go up every year. And more of the questions that I get on ticks, they start with things like, why does it feel like we have more ticks than ever? Other variations might be, will this be a bad tick year? I can't go anywhere without getting a tick. My dog is covered in ticks. You can see this poor puppy here on the left, absolutely littered with ticks in its ear. I have a lot of folks that work outside and contact me. They're either right-of-way maintenance or they're people who are farmers out with their cattle and things like that. And many of them have resorted to things like duct taping the bottom of their pant cuff. This person has sort of taped it closed and then flipped some of the tape around. So when the ticks climb on, they get stuck. I've met other people that when we're talking about this, they're so desperate, they're ready to start fires. They've heard that you can burn your land to try and drive the ticks out. And I've had 3 or 4 people in the last year or so ready with a match and gasoline to go out and get this started. And we have to try and talk them away from that because, one, I'm an entomologist. I don't really know how to give people fire prescriptions, but also there's mixed results with those kinds of things where the ticks are gone for a little while, but as vegetation comes back in, it creates perfect tick habitat, and then mice come in, and then there's ticks. It just starts to fuel itself back up. So there are seemingly more ticks now than there ever have been, and they're driving people kind of nuts. Some of the reasons that this is happening, we can look to climate change and follow that data. It's allowing ticks to expand their natural ranges to new locations. We're actually experiencing this in Kentucky with the black-legged deer tick. we're being invaded with a variant from the north that we expect to cause even more Lyme cases in the state of Kentucky. Climatic variability also impacts the growth of the weeds and vegetation that ticks live in. We also have higher populations of deer and higher populations of mice, and that can be tracked back to some of this data. And unfortunately, all of that just fuels tick populations. And then we also have to consider the fact that we are encroaching on these natural areas more and more. People are often moving in or building subdivisions or putting in housing parks and things like that in these sort of semi-wild areas like we see here. So we're moving into where the ticks are or where the other tick hosts are, and we're exposing ourselves seemingly more and more in these situations. All of this kind of woodlot area behind these homes, that's prime tick habitat where they could traverse from there to maybe get into the border of the yard. If you have a kid that goes out to play and kind of plays along the back edge there, they're possibly going to be exposed to ticks. We also have a lot of tick fear mongering that's going out on the social media airwaves. The fear of ticks, the rise in their populations, this is abused quite a bit on social media sites. These are all screen grabs from TikTok. I don't know how many of the folks watching are TikTokers, but if you ever get on there and you look up ticks, you'll find a lot of content that looks like this. It is fake infestations on people's skin. And for some reason, this gets a lot of heat on there. People really love to watch these videos. And these instances that you see here, the far left one, those are raisins that have been glued to this man's leg. If you look in the middle, these are beans. And then on the far right there, those are another set of beans and seeds. And they've been glued in some cases in manners that ticks might do. The raisins in the middle one are kind of right. If you look at that right one again, though, there are no ticks that go in color coordinated patterns like this and create this red border around white ticks. That's just not how it works. So for some folks, this is creepy. That's why they like to watch it. Other people, they say they find it satisfying to watch ticks being removed. And so if you look in the middle there, you'll see a pair of tweezers or pliers that are being moved towards the quote unquote tick, and they're going to pull it off. This is just super glued to the skin. So there is a removal process, but it's not a real tick removal. And for some reason, people do find this satisfying. It might go back into our kind of ancient brains back when we used to be infested with more parasites, that we enjoy this content. But you'll find a lot of this out there, and people think, oh, I can't go outside anymore because I'll end up with my entire knee and thigh completely coated in pumpkin seed sized ticks. And they're just terrified of this. It really, really fuels some of the tick paranoia that we have. So in order to kind of break through some of that, I just wanted to introduce the actual tick species that live in our Commonwealth and the tick species that can impact your health and some of your animals' health. The three that we're going to discuss in sort of the longest terms are black-legged ticks, also known as deer ticks. They're in that first row. Then the Lone Star tick, also known as turkey ticks or turkey mites. And then the American dog tick in that bottom row there, the biggest tick that we have on people in Kentucky. So these are also known as wood ticks. We'll start with the Lone Star tick. They are the most important tick in the state. They're the most common tick, and they're usually pretty easy to identify compared to other ticks. So if we look at them from the top down here, they typically have much longer mouth parts compared to other tick species. Their bodies are rounder, particularly as larvae and nymphs. They're almost hockey puck shaped, and they're still semicircular once they reach adulthood. The adult female, we encounter quite a few of those outside. They're the easiest to identify because of the single white dot on her scutum, which is the shield on top of her back here. And that's what gives them their name. They're not from Texas. That's not why they're called the Lone Star tick. They don't enjoy Walker, Texas Ranger, or anything like that. They get their name from this lone white dot on the female. The male, on the other hand, he has these four kind of yellow lines along the outside edge of his body, but by and large, not a lot of patterns, not a lot of interesting colors on the male. The adults of this species are active April through August. We get lots and lots of reports of these. They tend to be found in woodland areas with kind of a dense undergrowth. They do quest. they are the one exception to the rule I laid out before. We have seen these ticks sort of follow people before, unfortunately. The ticks you see on the left here were from a client that ended up with a couple dozen Lone Star ticks on their lower leg. They stepped into an area where they had hatched, and they ended up with lots of them on there. These are quite small. These would be seed ticks, but they are full of blood. The person didn't notice them until too late. And he didn't notice that he had them on him, but he had turned back at one point and he saw them following him. They were actually kind of coming out of the undergrowth and walking behind him, shambling, kind of like the Walking Dead, to try and climb aboard. But unfortunately, didn't know that he had some on there, finished his hike, and ended up with some bites. This is a chart from a survey that was done over 3 years here in Kentucky, showing you when these are most active as either immatures, as adults. So you can see the adults, they're the red bar. We are active from March into August, but the peak is kind of in the May to June timeframe. We also have nymphs in that time frame, so the middle stage, and then the larvae, those seed ticks, they're active anywhere from May into November. We have a little blip there in November, but the peak is obviously here in August. So that's when you're going to most likely end up with those seed ticks on you. The reason we worry about the Lone Star tick is not only because it's the most common tick, but also because it's the one that's associated with the transmission of the sugar molecule alpha-gal, which induces red meat allergy or alpha-gal syndrome. So if you enjoy lamb or beef or pork, if you like to eat deer meat, all of these are off the menu if you acquire this syndrome. So if you acquire it, what usually happens is you eat, say, a T-bone steak or a hamburger or a sausage, and then about 4 to 6 hours after eating that, you begin to experience allergic symptoms. So you have a lot of mucus production, you break out in hives, you may get a really upset stomach, you may have diarrhea. For other people, it even moves into difficulty breathing. You get hives on your face, your mouth starts to close up. Some people even have heart problems as a result of this, just like all allergic situations. When this happens, it's unfortunately almost instant. If a Lone Star tick has fed on another animal before it bites you, for some reason that we're not quite sure of yet, in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, this sugar molecule known as alpha-gal, it gets stuck in the tick's mouth. So when it bites you, it drops this into your bloodstream. We're one of the few animals that don't have this sugar molecule naturally within our bloodstream. So once it enters you, your body's like, whoop, whoop, whoop. This is an invader. It begins an immune response, and it tries to defeat this invader in your blood. Unfortunately, you are now primed for the next meal that you eat that includes red meat that contains alpha-gal from these mammals that we consume. Your body then sees alpha-gal in your stomach, and then it will send out that same immune response, which is when you start to have the allergic symptoms. This changes people's lives, obviously. This is going to mean that you can only eat things like poultry or fish. You may even be stuck with plant-based proteins. That can all be much more expensive than buying beef. We are the largest beef producing state east of the Mississippi River, so it also impacts people's livelihoods in this state. It's something that we're keeping a close eye on because Kentucky is sort of one of the battleground states for this, unfortunately. It's kind of centered around Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky. Rises in cases, but there's kind of this epicenter where all of those states that I mentioned just a second ago are kind of touching, and that seems to be where a lot of the problems are occurring, unfortunately. And so this is something that we try to teach a lot about because it can be very upsetting for people and very life impacting. Another tick that we have to talk about is the American dog tick. This used to be the most common tick in the state, but it has been supplanted by the Lone Star tick. They are kind of larger than the other ticks. They have short mouth parts compared particularly to the Lone Star, and they have a much more teardrop shaped body throughout their life. So we're looking at a female on the left on that skin, and then a male on the right. The females, they have a shorter scutum. Their shield on their back is much shorter, and it looks kind of like a lace doily collar draped around her neck. Whereas the male, his scutum goes tip to tail, basically. And so he's covered in this shield, and his has this kind of Rorschach ink blot pattern on the top of it. So it just looks slightly different compared to the other species. Again, these adults are active April to August. They're found in areas with little to no tree cover. They like grassy fields and to be along roads and walkways and trails. So they kind of hide down in these bound up areas, but they want to be places. Think about where your dog goes and likes to hang out when it's outside. These are the areas that the dog ticks like to be in. That is an animal that they seem to prefer and frequent. So they're questing here at about dog height in these overgrown areas. The survey that I mentioned before, it's almost exclusively adults that were collected in the survey. And again, you can see that pattern from March into August, a little blip there in September. The immatures were much more difficult to discover for this species. So we know that they're active May and June, but we didn't get a lot of data on those, unfortunately. That could mean that they're not as big of a deal for humans in particular, but with this, we're still looking into where and when those populations are out. The reason that we care about this tick is it spreads the most common tick-borne illness in the state, which is Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Unfortunately, the name of this disease kind of implies that it's out west only, when really it's much more common on this side of the country. And Kentucky has quite a few cases of this every year. It feels a lot like a flu. You get a high fever, you get a lot of body aches. As it progresses, you may end up with this red spotted rash that you see on the far right here. This can be on the palms and on the soles of the feet. The tick usually has to feed on the host for between 4 to 10 hours in order to vector this pathogen. So you do have a window of time that you can remove the tick and hopefully prevent disease transmission. But this is an issue in the state. It hospitalizes quite a few people. It can even be lethal. There is about a 30% mortality rate when this is left untreated. That leads us to the black-legged deer tick, perhaps the most famous tick species in Kentucky and in the eastern United States. The adult female is the one that most people encounter. She's easier to identify than the rest of the group here because of this red-orange coloration to the rear of her abdomen. The larva and nymph, they're kind of see-through. The adult male, he's a dark chocolate brown with kind of a cream-colored horseshoe around his body. Luckily, the female is much easier to identify, and this seems to be the one that most people capture if they're dealing with black-legged deer ticks. They want to be found in areas where their preferred hosts, the white-tailed deer, are living. In Kentucky, that seems to be just about everywhere, but in particular, right the middle of the road. It seems like I see more and more deer kind of that have been hit here in Kentucky. That's not really where they live, but it is an indicator of just how high their populations are and how much we've encroached on their habitat. So we're often in areas where these deer are, some people purposefully because they're hunting them. And so when you're doing that, you are also exposing yourself potentially to the black-legged deer tick. One of the interesting things about this species is that they're active in the offset months compared to the other ticks. They are much more common as adults from October into March of the next year. Any day above freezing, so we've had a lot of those this past winter. We had kind of a toasty winter. This tick is out and about in the winter looking for hosts, which can include people. Here's that time frame. So those adults, October into even June, it looks like here we've got a blip in that month, but they're in the offset kind of time frame compared to the other tick species, with the immatures being more of a summer and fall phenomenon. So if you go out in the fall or in the winter to do any hunting, you are possibly being exposed to these ticks. The reason that they're famous is that they are the only vector for Borrelia burgdorferi, which is the pathogen that causes Lyme disease. This is something that's on the rise in Kentucky. We are not as filled with Lyme as like a New England state would be, but we have this really common misconception in Kentucky that we're safe from Lyme disease. This is kind of an old doctor's tale, I guess you could say, where they would say, oh, we don't have Lyme here. That's not true. We do have quite a bit of Lyme in the state, and it's on the rise. We're seeing cases go up every year. So Lyme disease is most famous for causing sort of fever and stiffness and fatigue, just like a flu would, but most famous for producing the erythema migrans bullseye rash. Not everybody gets this rash. A lot of people do if they're infected, but you can't count on that. You really need to count on tick identification. If you were bitten by this tick, it is best to go to your doctor and ask to get checked out. They may even preventively go ahead and put you on some antibiotics. to try and clear you out so that you don't end up with this stuck in your body. Generally considered to require a feeding time of about 36 hours for this pathogen to move from the tick into your body, but that's just sort of a guideline. It's not a necessarily resolute thing. That leads me to the final tick species I wanted to discuss, which is the Asian longhorn tick. So these other three, they're kind of the classic suspects when it comes to biting ticks in Kentucky. This is a new one. This is the new blood-sucking parasite on the block. It's an invasive species from Eastern Asia. It was accidentally introduced to the United States through international trade, most likely in livestock. This was first confirmed in the United States in 2017. It may have been here as early as 2010. Other reports say it arrived in 2015. Regardless of the exact year that it got here, we do know that we've intercepted it many times at different ports and destroyed it, but somewhere along the line it slipped through and it ended up getting established first in New Jersey and then moving from there. So New Jersey, on a sheep farm, they had 2 lambs that exsanguinated. They bled to death basically, and it was a result of a tick infestation. After looking into the ticks more, it was discovered they were a non-native species, and then it was discovered that they were this invasive species. So this is a map showing some of the progress. We have had 9 confirmed Kentucky reports, and these have involved Boone, Floyd, Madison, Martin Breathitt, Perry, Barron, and Metcalfe counties. So not Letcher specifically today, but this is an area that we would be paying close attention to if we were able to go out and do surveillance work, because there's some wild areas, but not only that, if you look the Virginia, the West Virginia kind of zone, these are areas where we have lots of these ticks being discovered, typically on wildlife. The 2 earliest cases in yellow here in Kentucky involved a black bear that crossed the state line and an elk that crossed the state line. The green ones, on the other hand, have involved cattle. These have all been found on cow farms where there were lots and lots of ticks discovered. The case in gray here in Madison County, this was a person from Tennessee. They were a construction worker, from what I remember. They came up to do some contract work and found the tick on them here, but most likely had acquired it back home in Tennessee. But since it was discovered here, we are the ones that get to report it. So it is here in the state. That's kind of a wide distribution. You can see a bit of a line in southeastern Kentucky there. We're afraid that many of these counties in between the ones already colored in could have these ticks. They just haven't been discovered yet. The reason that we're kind of concerned here in Kentucky, this is a map projecting where this tick will do the best based on its biology and where it lives in Asia. And you can see an area, the darker red it is, the better this tick is going to do there. The entire state of Kentucky basically is colored in this dark maroon color. So it seems they really want to come here. They want to go on the Bourbon Trail. They want to take in a Wildcats game. It just seems like this habitat that we provide in our state matches up really well with where they're from in Asia. So it could move in and kind of do so in force. It's also been found on a lot of different hosts. It has a potentially pretty wide range of hosts it could feed on. I've shown you lots of horrifying tick images, and I'm going to show you more here. So I picked out some mostly baby animals to show for this particular slide. It's been found on dogs. It's been found on white-tailed deer, raccoons, cattle, possums, elk. It's been found on turkeys and hawks. Quite a few different animals have been discovered to be able to have this host or this parasite on them, unfortunately, including us people. The reason that we worry about this tick is that it reproduces asexually. So that means that they don't need to mate. In fact, here in the United States, we have only found females of this tick. We have found no males. So you'll see these headlines sometimes about the self-cloning tick, the all-female tick brigade, these kinds of things that people point out about this species. If you've ever had aphids on a plant, it kind of resembles that. The main difference being that these ticks have to crawl on and off their hosts in order to develop, unlike aphids. But in this case, the comparison is apt because aphids reproduce asexually. The female gives birth to daughters that can quickly develop and then give birth to their own daughters. But in this case, females, they produce these eggs that are full of clones. They're just making tick after tick after tick after tick. This can cause extreme blood loss. In fact, from what I remember, we had a calf last year that either almost or did exsanguinate due to an infestation of Asian longhorn tick. They're also notoriously difficult to identify. They are smaller than most of the other tick species that we deal with here in Kentucky. They are just kind of a chocolate brown color. They don't have any conspicuous markings or distinct coloration. Their mouth parts are shorter when compared to other native ticks. And when you pair those traits up, it can be somewhat easy to do in the field to differentiate these. But I would point out that the adult longhorn tick here under the word longhorn ticks, it looks very similar to the male Lone Star tick, seen as the male and immature forms of the black-legged deer tick. So in order to differentiate these, we would look at the mouth parts for kind of a quick and dirty ID. If you look at the Lone Star tick, their mouth, it sticks out like if you put your two fingers in front of your mouth and pretended to be a tick, you would push both your forefingers out straight. If you were pretending to be an Asian longhorn tick, you would curl them and touch your first knuckles together in front of your mouth. And that's much more what the Asian longhorn tick mouth looks like. So that's to differentiate with the Lone Star tick. We can also do it with the black-legged deer tick. Those shapes are distinct enough from one another that we can get some clarity about what we're looking at. Thus far, this has not spread any pathogens that affect humans in the United States. None of this has happened in the field. There was a lab-based study that said they could possibly vector Rocky Mountain spotted fever, but it hasn't happened out in the real world yet. So we're keeping an eye on that. It does spread tularemia. This was done in Tennessee and Kentucky just a couple summers ago. This is a different kind of pathogen. That's it here in purple. It gets into cattle and it can cause problems with spontaneous abortions and bred heifers. It's a lifelong problem. They can't get rid of it. There's no prevention and there's no cure. Beef that is contaminated with tularemia can be eaten. If they've been infected, it can still be consumed. So usually these animals are slaughtered and then processed because otherwise they become this lifelong reservoir for the pathogen and they could get ticks infected that will then infect more cattle. People don't get tularemia either through ingestion or being bitten. This is something that we're purely worried about with our cattle herd in Kentucky. I just wanted to conclude with some tips and tricks to try and prevent problems with ticks. I have pointed out the time frame of most of these species. The high tick season here in Kentucky is May to June. It's important to point out you're never free of ticks in the bluegrass state. We need to be vigilant for them January to December of every year. But if you were going to be looking at for ticks very specifically, then May to June is really the time frame where we get the most exposed. You can prevent some of them from climbing onto you by wearing light colored clothing with sleeves and pants. I know it gets hot, but this is cutting off access to your skin. You can also tuck your pants down into your socks or duct tape them, as I showed earlier. This cuts off one of the easiest access points that ticks use to get on people, which is to crawl under the pant cuff and then sort of sneak up our leg because we can't see them. If you tuck your pants in, though, it not only looks really fashionable, you look really cool, but it cuts off that route and then they can't take advantage of it as easily. We also encourage folks to do tick checks as regularly as possible, at least once a day, particularly if you're an outdoor type person. I tell people, even if you've been out just weeding the garden for like 30 minutes, it's good to come in and do a pat down and make sure you haven't picked up a tick while you were out there. But especially if you're gone camping, if you're going fishing, if you went on a deer trip, you need to check yourself while you're there, but especially when you get home to make sure that nobody's climbed on board and is getting ready to take a bite out of you. So look in and around your hair, in and around your ears, under your arms and your armpit area, inside of your belly button, around your waist, in your groin, and then behind your knees as well as your ankles. You should also, if you take your pets with you outside, your dog needs checked regularly, your cat needs checked regularly. Even if you treat them for fleas and ticks, the ticks can still get on them. We've had people that they were bitten by a tick in their bed because their dog sleeps with them. The dog had flea and tick medicine. The tick climbed on, is like, I don't want to eat this dog. And they were in the bed with the person and the tick crawled off and crawled over and most likely bit the person there because we found other ticks kind of in the bed area. So these are all things that we have to be considering when we're thinking about these little sneaky blood-stealing ninjas. You can also use repellents to keep you safe from tick bites. These are the same things that we would use for mosquitoes. Luckily, they also impact these. DEET is the standby. The more there is in the product, so the higher percentage it says, they usually range between 40 to 100% DEET, the longer it lasts. So 40% DEET here, they're saying you get about 8 hours of protection. If you wear the 100%, you're getting more like 10 hours of protection. You can sweat these off of you, from picaridin to IR35 to oil of lemon eucalyptus. All of these can be sweat off or rained off of you, so you may have to reapply, but they go directly on the skin and you smell distasteful at this point. The tick isn't going to want to bite you. We can also kill ticks. This is for people who maybe are loggers or people who go hunting a lot or crawling around in the brush if they're going fishing. You would be really doing yourself a favor if you treated your clothes with permethrin or bought permethrin impregnated clothing in order to wear on these kinds of excursions. Permethrin is an insecticide. We use it for a variety of pest control situations. Once it's sprayed onto clothes, once it's dry, it's safe to wear those clothing items. It doesn't come back out of the clothes onto your skin. But when ticks crawl onto the material, they're exposed to the permethrin and then killed. So you'll go home and you'll shake your pants out and take them off, and about 12 dead ticks will fall off of there, and you'll feel very satisfied because of this. We do want to be careful with this. Do not apply it to your skin directly. Do wait for the clothes to be dry before putting them on, if you're not buying the impregnated clothing. And then also keep this away from cats. Permethrin can be hazardous to cats, so we try to keep it as away from them as possible. You can potentially treat your yard or have it treated. This would be done in May and June to try and prevent tick bites. This would usually involve bifenthrin or permethrin in the kind of curated landscape that you might have. If you've got areas that look kind of like this with shrubs and flowers and annuals and perennials, you don't need to treat the entire yard. This is usually a perimeter spray or a perimeter application, as well as to hotspot areas like this shrubby looking spot that we see here. A wall-to-wall application is a waste of insecticide and money. We don't need to treat the middle of the yard because ticks just don't want to live there. They may accidentally fall off a squirrel and be out there, but they're not going to be able to survive there for very long. We can also modify the habitat around us to try and lower tick pressure. So doing things like creating a tick exclusion zone where you've done a lot of brush removal and you may put down rock barrier or wood chips to try and create a zone where no plants are going to grow and hopefully prevent the ticks from being able to survive there. You can also cut down on wood piles or keep them far away from the home or from a shed so that it is tougher to tote your wood, but it is going to cut down on habitats for mice and therefore for ticks near the home. You can do the treatments that I just laid out, and you can focus on areas where maybe kids play or things like that, just trying to make sure that we're not creating habitat that the ticks can take advantage of. If all of that fails and you do end up with a tick on you, the best way to get a tick off is to use tweezers or forceps. You get as close to your skin as possible and grip the tick's head and then pull steadily up and remove the tick. You don't want to grip it and rip it because you might break pieces of the tick off in you. You don't want to wiggle the tick around for the same reason or twist it around. All of that can be very hazardous and create a further infection by leaving pieces of the tick in you. It's not going to slide right out like a straw from a top of a cup, but if you do pull steadily up, you will eventually pull the tick out. You'll want to clean the wound that they've given you and maybe keep the tick on hand. I encourage people to put it in a Ziploc bag and freeze it. You could also put it in a bag or a cup and put alcohol in there and preserve the tick. The reason that you want to keep it is if you start to experience any rash at the bite site, or if you start to feel a fever or anything like that, you'll have the tick to show to your doctor who should be able to identify it. And if they can't, they can always ask people like myself. If you don't have the tick, it'll be a lot of guesswork as to what pathogen you've been exposed to. The other thing I like to stress is that we should not use fire like a cigarette or a spent match on the tick while it's plugged into you. Don't pour rubbing alcohol or drinking spirits on the tick while it's plugged into you. Don't pour essential oils on it. It is true that if you do these things, the tick will disengage and back out. But first, you've agitated it while it's plugged into your skin. And if you do that, they often vomit. So you're increasing the possibility that a pathogen goes from the tick into your bloodstream because you're making them puke like a freshman into your body. So get the tick off of you first, out of you first, and then you can kill it with these other methods if you don't want to keep it. But I would encourage you to keep it on hand in case you need it identified. Sorry for all the grotesque imagery. I know that the ticks are frustrating. I hope that some of these tips and tricks will keep you healthy and safe this summer, and that you know that you can still enjoy Kentucky and get out there and enjoy everything we have to offer. But we do need to take some of these preventative steps to try and keep them from getting on us. I appreciate the invite, and I'll take any questions if we've got them.
Excellent job.
How many ticks have you pulled off yourself this year, Shad?
3, 2 were nymphs, 1 was an adult. They were Lone Star. The one Lone Star had attached. I did not keep it. I threw it away. The mouth part must have still been in me because it stayed agitated and itchy, and eventually that went away. So far, I can still eat hamburgers. So how quickly does that allergy develop?
Usually people notice it within not too long after the tick bite. It can happen as soon as the next meal after you've been bitten by the tick.
Okay. So if it's been a week, and
You're
I'm
probably through the veil.
all right, good deal. You didn't mention winter ticks. I don't.
I don't get a lot of questions on winter ticks. I do know that they're around. We've had some submitted for diagnosis because they thought they were the longhorn tick, but I didn't know. I apologize. I'll add that in for next time.
Is that? I mean, do you know much about them?
It
Other than
seems
those are the ones that get on the moose that bleed the moose out.
right. Yeah, I haven't heard of them vectoring anything to people. That's one of the reasons that they don't sort of rise to the top of my list.
Okay. And I guess you and I had talked about this, but the general public may want to know the notion about the coyotes and the bears and things, kind of as their populations have gone up, and they've helped spread, like the Lone Star. I guess people want to know why suddenly are we finding this in such
Yeah,
large numbers?
it's interesting because like I can see back a few years on some of the things that we've published from the Extension Entomology group, and I see these early articles about like Lone Star tick introduced, Lone Star tick on the move, Lone Star tick on the rise, all these kinds of things. I don't know why it says I was raising my hand. Uh, it seems like it moved in quite quickly, and it came from the west. I can't speak exactly to why. I would argue that it probably has a lot more to do with habitat changes and the temperature of Kentucky becoming more amenable to it. It could have to do with mice. It could have to do with deer. They will feed on both of those things. But yeah, they've just kind of swept in from the western half of the state and taken over all of Kentucky.
It's kind of curious that black-legged tick is coming south from up north.
Yes, we have had lots of discussions about that. So there's two variants of that tick, the northern variant and then the southern variant. The southern variant is the one we would probably want, actually. They live down south. They often stay in the leaf litter to try and keep cool and out of the sun. And so they end up on lizards and snakes, and they don't spread Lyme as much. But as in the north, they're more up in the air, waiting for the deer. So they're hanging out kind of where the deer height would be. They end up spreading much more Lyme disease, unfortunately, because that's where humans are going to pick them up. And yeah, for some reason, that's the variant that's leaking into Kentucky rather than the southern one.
Okay.
Well,
Any
thanks.
other?
I know this is a great lunchtime discussion, blood
Oh
feeding
yeah, I
ectoparasites.
just I do have a question for you. Do you automatically record?
No, I wasn't automatically. It says it's recording.
Yeah, I hit the record button, but it didn't actually take until it was about 2 minutes in. So I was just kind of hoping maybe that you had,
Oh, I'm
but
sorry.
if you don't automatically record, I'll go ahead and stop.